So welcome everybody. This is a fangirl moment for me because if you read my digest, you know that I'm a huge fan of Irina's, who is a medieval literature professor, and I'm a medieval literature noob. So this is like completely a not balanced situation, and I will love that. I've long been fascinated by the whole phenomenon of self-help, and one of the ways in which I can kind of understand what it's about is looking at its history. And one of the people who's writing, especially in TLS, Times Literary Supplement, I've been most enjoying is Irina's. We will hear a little bit about your background and how you were dropped into this whole exploration and this whole journey. And we will see where self-help comes from, if it's really the self that should help itself or some external force. And I hope that, this is long, guys, so we are also here to hear from you. And I hope that you came with a couple of interesting questions. If not, that they will come up in your mind as we're proceeding with the conversation. So if that's all good, I'm going to pass the mic on to Irina. Are you happy to share just a little bit about your story and how you ended up researching old texts? What makes you so good at seeing these contemporary analogies and finding these timeless bits of personal, human nature, good, the good, the bad there, and the stuff that doesn't seem to change. And welcome to Interintellect.
Hi. Hi. Hello, everyone. And hi, Jaisal. It's nice to see you. I guess not quite in person, but to see you, to put a face to the name. So I am an immigrant kid and I was supposed to be a physician. And in my first year of undergrad, I kind of strategically did very poorly in my science classes, but I had the good luck that at the very last moment I switched from physics to English and I fell in love with it. I hated English in high school, but I loved it in university. And then I thought, okay, now that I'm doing something completely useless career-wise, what is the most useless course I can take? And that was Old English, which I don't want to waste your time, but I know we have a while, so I will tell the story. There was a man in my college whose nickname was Beowulf, and he would come to he had taken the introduction to Old English class. He would come to every college party with a fake Viking horn helmet and an IKEA rug over his shoulder, the fur ones, and he would read some Old English to the...
That's exactly how people imagine humanities.
We were all drunk. We thought this was great, and then I thought, okay, I'll take Old English because Beowulf, he lent me his grammar too, which was sticky. I didn't ask. And then I think it was the mystery that got to me. So I love all literature. For me, I'm not necessarily a person who thinks I'm only interested in medieval literature, even though the job forces you to specialize. But I don't care what language it's in. I don't care what time period. But what I love about medieval literature is that from the beginning, it felt like a mystery. Partly there isn't as much work on medieval literature. Scholars haven't really, if you work on Hamlet, you have to go, wade through so much scholarship. I wanted to read the literature really, and not so much of the scholarship. This is my not very well-kept secret. And with a lot of medieval texts, some of them have only been edited recently, they've only been edited well recently. So there's a feeling, even though it's very old, there's a feeling of uncovering something new, which I love, which is why I also really enjoy reviewing brand new books. It's kind of the same feeling for me. I get to make up my mind about it. And then, this question of the human aspect of it, I think it was exactly, how can I put it? Medieval literature, it was always clear it comes out of such a different culture that it's always going to be fundamentally strange to me. These are people who thought differently, I'm not particularly religious, but even if I were, I don't think it would be the same religious faith exactly. I think it's just such a different world. And yet within that difference, you can glimpse the humanity. And maybe it's a little bit of a kind of a bias. I tend to read for the connections. I tend to read for the similarities. But somehow I do have the feeling that they were dealing with some of the same issues that we are. even if it just looked so different for them and the way they express it is so different. You know, they might write an allegorical poem about it instead of a realist novel, but they're still dealing with being human on this earth, you know. And even, you know, the more I spend time with it and the more that technology changes our lives, I think that even despite the technologies that have changed, they still deal with some of the same psychological issues. They just look very, you know, on the surface they're different, but you dig down a little bit and you get to human beings. And I love that there's that, I don't know, that contrast to me is so um, compelling and mysterious. And I keep wanting to sort of solve the riddle and get close to these people.
Oh, I love this. We recently did an event on historical fiction, and a large chunk of the conversation revolved around Hilary Mantel's work. I'm kind of obsessed with A Place of Greatest Safety, and we were talking about the Wolf Hall trilogy as well. And one of the things that we touched upon, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this, because this is also I love this idea of like being, you know, literary detectives and kind of like, you know, possession style dive into the great unknown. But there's also the great unknown of the cognitive system that these people existed in.
Mm.
Most likely, or most especially religiousness, and taking religiousness for granted, right? So it's not an option, it's the default. I will tell you
I'm
my
a little
thesis, and then you
skeptical
will
there.
tell me how I'm wrong, okay? So the Hilary Mantel Salon, we were discussing how difficult it is for contemporary people to model the representational, you know, system of the people of the past who were
Mm.
religious, because we don't even know how to enter that building, really. They had a contemplative life, a life of the soul that we don't necessarily have. And Hilary Mantel was brought up as one of the people who kind of lets you into that building. So like you read about, you know, I don't know, Anne Boleyn, and there's something there that this unknown, little bit strange element added to otherwise very familiar situations, that is this kind of contemplative life that comes from default religiousness. This was our thesis. How
Yeah.
are we wrong?
Well, no, I wouldn't say you're wrong. I would say I have, you know, I think scholars, when they look at the Middle Ages, do assume a kind of baseline religiousness. And let's say, I'm going to sort of like put an asterisk beside what I say and say, well, you know, when I'm talking about medieval, I mean Western medieval and mostly Christian, because that's what I know about. I don't know very much about Jewish communities of the Middle Ages, although they existed, right? In Germany, where I'm in Bonn right now. This is really where Ashkenaz, like the second Ashkenaz, was. It's where Yiddish begins. There are Muslim communities in Europe. I just don't know very much about those, so I'll put that's the limit of my ignorance. Um, that said, I think the word religious is not very, it's kind of a problem because it encompasses so much human experience and types of faith and belief and lack of belief. You know, I mean, I think back to when I lived in Dallas, a friend of mine told me that she went to church because that was, you know, she was African American, and that was like the way to network with people and to get to know with people and to make a community. It's not that she didn't believe it, it's that that wasn't her main motivation to go to church, you know. And I think if we sort of look at the people we know in our experience, people have very vastly different experiences of faith, and it changes over a lifetime too. So that, and obviously they don't always tell other people what's going on the inside. And I think that's actually, I mean, there's been some work on this, done on this as well by historians. You know, I think we sort of tend to think, oh, you know, everybody in the Middle Ages is going to church all the time. Well, no, even, you know, Western Christians, maybe they confess once a year, you know. um, okay, you have the Crusades, which are motivated nominally by faith, but there are all kinds of other motivations mixed into that as well. Um, I think there are surprising moments um, of people, Christians, being able to imagine what it might be like to either not believe in God or believe in another God, even if it's in the context of a dialogue which is meant to show the superiority of Christianity. Sometimes they give the Muslim or the Jew very good arguments. you know. So, or you have moments where it's clear that the doubt in Christian dogma is very strong, but there aren't as really clear ways to express that in society. So I think it's hard to get at the sort of the variety of religious experience through what they left. And especially if you think about the fact that a lot of the writing is being, written down by people connected to the church. So, it's going to be a kind of biased set of, texts that we have. And I just think, I'll give you an example. I wrote about this in my last TLS column. Marjorie Kemp, um, great self-help woman for us to talk about later because she liked to read this literature. She lived in the late 14th century, early 15th century, middle-class woman who started having, after a sort of very bad pregnancy and what looks like a postpartum depression, she started to, first she was suicidal and she saw demons and so on. And then Christ came down to her, had a little chat with her. And after that, she started having visions of God, of both God the Father and God the Son, a kind of spiritual marriage with God the Father. She sleeps and she has sort of erotic experiences with Jesus, all kinds of things. She meets all the saints. She's better than Mary Magdalene and so on. And I think it's easy to sort of think, okay, here was someone who claimed to have these visions. They don't make sense for our, well, I don't want to speak for everyone in our, but a lot of people would doubt that today. But she lived in a more religious time. Except if you read the book she had written about her own experience, people doubt her. Even people of the church doubt her. And some of them get Marjorie Kemp, Kempe. And there's a good translation, recent translation of her book from Oxford World Classics by Anthony Bale. So people just get really angry at her when she talks about her visions or she starts to have these sobbing fits that are supposed to be God's grace. And, they'll say, well, it's a disease, or she has mental illness, or she's got something wrong with her. And if only she would admit it, that she's actually sick, we could deal with it. But we can't deal with the fact that she says it's from God. And so even in this, highly religious time, when somebody walks around saying they're a visionary, a lot of people just don't believe them. They think they're faking it. So I find that that's interesting data because she's the one who shows us that people don't believe her. And it would have been completely in her interest to say, everybody understood that this was God's grace when I started weeping and falling on the floor and lost control of my body. But no, people are skeptical.
That's so interesting. Thank you so much. I never heard of Cam before, and thanks for sharing the name Eli in the chat. I think what I was getting at was more maybe a baseline belief in life after death. So it's more of an eschatological worldview. I think it's hard for us to, even when, I hear people converting to religions these days or being at least a little bit bi-curious, especially conservative friends about the life of the soul. I always think that we kind of have an eschatological limit as humans living in the age of absolute technology. And it's hard for us to identify with adults who thought that, maybe who took hell as literally as we might. But maybe I'm underestimating my forefathers here, and they were like, no, that's just a
Sure, I
tale.
have plenty of people in my family who believe in life after death. No,
Yeah.
I don't think that's a Middle Ages versus modernity difference.
Yeah, but I mean, so you don't think that the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason brought in fundamental differences in how I think that could
I
be a
do, yeah.
kind of segue, because I do think that there is a paradigm shift there that is pretty hard to fully piece together. But I would really love to start talking a little bit about self-help, because one of the accusations against contemporary self-help is that it has been decoupled a little bit from social responsibility and from care for other people. Not always, but I mean, we talk a lot about self-love, and somehow we feel, especially the most progressive, even the most progressive TikToker will feel relatively comfortable, emphasizing self-care and self-love, whilst also feeling extremely guilty and actively engaged in, bettering society. Do you see that there is a direct line in which self-help developed in the past, say, 300 years, or do you feel that there was some kind of dip here in in how morality and us trying to exist better in the world is
Oh,
approached.
yeah. And, yes, well, it's mixed. It's mixed. I think first of all, you have to sort of go back to the question is what is self-help in the Middle Ages? Because obviously there aren't books called self-help books. But I was thinking about this earlier, and I was thinking there are a lot of texts that we could think of as self-help that today, if you were looking for that information, you would go to the self-help shelf. That's what I mean. And you have political advice literature, so Mirrors for Princes, which is not just advice for princes, but also advice for anyone who might have to deal with power, with differences of power. That's maybe the business advice book, right? You have various kinds of proverbs, fables, which are taught in schools. So really one of the very first genres that children encounter, especially if let's say they're learning Latin in school, they will be learning and maybe translating, maybe memorizing fables, maybe discussing the meaning of them. And fables are also, they seem to be about animals, but they're actually about power, right? They're about more and less powerful. And this is a world genre, right? Which comes to Europe partly through Aesop, to Western Europe, but partly through the Panchatantra, which I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, which sort of comes to Persian and Arabic to European culture. This is just one of the most popular in ancient genres in the world. And it's a serious genre, although it seems playful, right? The animal tale. I would count that, right? Because I think it's advice literature. And
So
advice.
you so beautifully, to just add a note to you, so
Yeah.
beautifully explore in one of your pieces in Times New Supplement how wise these people were in not trying to give directly any advice. That they knew that we will tell you a story about this like turtle and you'll figure it out.
Yeah.
We are forgetting that, no?
Well, they do. I mean, this is the thing that I think is more medieval than modern, and is that they often play with it, So they'll often stick a moral onto something, and the moral won't fit. And the point is, I mean, there are multiple examples of this, of just kind of an example or a little tale that's clearly supposed to have a moral, and then the moral just has nothing to do with the story, or it doesn't really make sense, or it's not wise. And I think it's because they always also really deep within Western medieval culture is a kind of mocking of authority. And so there's this giving of advice, but actually the person who's receiving it has to work it out by themselves. My favorite for this one is a 14th century Spanish collection of stories called El Conde Lucanor. I can write that in the chat. The Count Lucanor. You can there's a translation of this on archive.org, like an old translation that's free to access now. And it's this the Count Lucanor, and I think it's Petronio is his advisor, and he tells him these stories to kind of illustrate liner, giving the moral. And
So
it has
we lost
nothing.
this one sentence. I'm sorry to interrupt. We lost
Yes.
a half sentence from you.
Which one?
Just like the one before. Can you repeat the sentence?
Yes, so you have the
Sorry.
Count Lucanor, and he will often have a kind of political situation that he's dealing with. And obviously the advisor is always smarter than the politician, than the king. The advisor, Petronio, tells him a little story to illustrate the situation. And then at the end of the story, there are about 2 lines that give the moral. And they have nothing to do with the story, like ridiculously nothing, not even by a stretch. And I think that's part of the sort of the humor of medieval advice, that you're kind of supposed to see how often it doesn't work or what the mismatches are, or you're supposed to figure it out yourself to some extent, even when it's this advice giving situation. Yeah, so where were we? I just had to mention El Conde Lucanor
I
because
love
I
it.
love
I mean, we were talking about that there's some accusation against contemporary self-help. It's a kind of amoral or like extra moral situation where you're not supposed to. It's just about like feeling good,
You know
being
what?
successful. But it sounds like it's been a
Not
time
so
of
much. Charity is in the sense of love for one's fellow man comes up a lot, but that's not what the text I'm thinking about really deal with. I mean, you have texts about manners, you have even the religious texts, right? Even the texts which are really kind of very popular, religious guides for, you know, how to pray to God, how to sort of cultivate your soul. Of course, charity we will be part of that, but it's often just very much about the singular connection between the individual and God. So there's not, I don't see that much of a social element, I'm afraid to say. They were really just as concerned with themselves
We've
as
always
we
been
are.
just like
No,
live out
and
the
a lot of
endless.
it is about, you know, the secular stuff often has to do with how you go up in the world, you know, how you, if you're, you know, socially ambitious, there's some great, you know, English material, how you learn to occupy a different class than the one you were raised in. So there's social mobility, especially in the late Middle Ages. And they're interested in, you know, the right manners, the right behavior, the right clothes, the right networking opportunities. Go to war in France, you know, hang out with the royals who are also at war with France. But really, they have a very strong sense of upward mobility and social ambition.
And how to
Yeah.
get to the right, how to get to the right Interintellect salon medievally, the right salons with the right people. I know that you are writing a book, a new book about perfectionism and your own perfectionism, and how stories about perfectionism abound in medieval literature and medieval self-help literature. How did we approach human anxieties
Mm.
in that era, when, you know, we were thought to be inhabited by demons and succubi and all sorts of things were coming to us from the outside, versus today when everything is our mother's fault? How do you see any analogies, any big differences, anything that we should learn from our medieval forefathers and mothers?
I think, you know, every culture has its own ideas of perfection and its own ideas of imperfection. And I have this kind of, I can't prove this theory, but my theory is the stronger the ideals of perfection, the stronger the ideals are, the more coherent is also their idea of imperfection, what kind of positive imperfection. So yeah, they don't blame their mothers. Although in some cases you do, I think you can, there are some people you could do a Freudian reading of and not be too far off. Um, uh, Trying to remember the name of this 12th century scholar who was beaten very harshly by his schoolmaster, was hired by his mother, but then his mother wanted to fire the schoolmaster for beating him so much, but he loved him. He loved was like a father to him. He loved the schoolmaster. The schoolmaster was an idiot. His Latin was really bad. He beat the child in order to cover up the fact that that his Latin was bad. Gilbert of Nogent, that's his name. Yeah, and then he later winds up really interested in relics of the I can't believe we're already going here. I apologize to everyone in this salon. Gilbert of Nogent had this situation with the schoolmaster who beat him, and then later he becomes obsessed, among other things, with the one relic of Christ. And of course, there's only one relic of Jesus, only one bit of Jesus remains on earth, which is the foreskin. And there are a lot of Jesus foreskins in medieval Europe. Right. It's a little bit of a problem. Which one is the real one? So I think if you wanted to do a Freudian reading of Gilbert, you would not be too far off. But it's true, I think, that in many other situations, they think of original sin, if they're Christian, obviously. I mean, again, I'm talking about the Christians. They think of the problem of original sin. So to some extent, they come out sinful, and they're never going to be perfect, no matter what they do in this lifetime, or, you know, it's just not available. It's not available to be a perfect human being. That die was cast already. And yes, they really do understand temptation or sin, often as demonic temptation. But the interesting thing is, God has to allow the devil to tempt you because God is all powerful. So Marjorie Kemp, for example, has this scene in her book where her faith falters a little bit in God, and he allows the devil to tempt her for 14 days. And it's a very erotic temptation. It's very explicit. I can always tell when my students have done the reading up to that point, because the ones who have this big smile on their face, and the ones who haven't have no clue what's going on when I start talking about the phalluses. But she's tempted. But it's interesting. It's still God's decision to allow the devil to tempt a human being. So it's kind of God's plan, even if it's the devil thinks he's doing, something, he's tempting or he's fighting against God, but the devil actually doesn't have that much power in the whole scenario, at least in in the stories I know. That is different. I think
And there's also a lot of
today
despair, right? I mean, from just my readings, I went to Catholic school. I was the only Jew in the building, so I was like hyper interested in everything that anybody ever said, kind of overcompensating. And I remember reading a lot in the contemplative texts about despair. And now that I have a little bit more more experience about despair than just Catholic school provided, even though it did provide ample causes for it, I come to understand that it's kind of an umbrella term for a lot of different things. And
like what?
What we might call depression, what we might call anxiety, just heartache. Maybe I would imagine probably like physical ailments manifesting as mental health issues. And I feel like maybe, and this is again, please tell me how I'm wrong here. But I feel like up to maybe Victorian times, it feels that we were a little bit more comfortable with inner conflicts than we are today. We have a lot of personal storytelling in contemporary literature and contemporary, scholarship, a lot of autobiographical elements, but we like to externalize our conflicts. I think this is why Freud was such a revelation for the modern individual and an individualist setting, because it allows you to externalize internal conflicts, right? And I'm really curious whether you would agree with that, and whether these imagined dialogues, are really some kind of internal resolution of a conflict, or an internal kind of division or disagreement, versus what we try to do today, where you are supposed to be very agentic and go and actually change the world, find the culprit, go into therapy and realize how you are perfect and will be forever. Am I on the right track here, or is this the wrong framing?
Oh, you're just giving me a lot. Let me start at the end. I think, they had confession, right? They had confession. So it certainly wasn't therapy that, quote, therapy that told you were okay. Part of the process of confession is to figure out the precise nature of the sin. And this is one of the interesting things. I haven't worked on this at all, but I want to at some point, because they have preacher's manuals, right? Confessor's manuals in the late Middle Ages, which are a guide for the priest who's confessing someone, to figure out exactly the nature, the very precise nature of their sin. And the key is to do that without giving them fresh ideas for ways to sin. There's always the problem of confession is that, they also understand this is a challenging relation between two people, right? So they have confession, and who's to say, maybe, I have never been confessed, but I wonder if that's not maybe sometimes quite helpful to just confess and then get your penance and then be done with it. And I suspect it probably depended on the personality. Some people were, figured, oh, I'll just confess at the end of my life or give a lot to the church and I'm set. Some people, it didn't matter how much they confessed, they would always feel that there was something left, or, again, I feel like I want to embrace that variety in the way human beings are, but I also have evidence of this. Yeah, so I think they had, in that sense, they had someone to talk to about the dark parts of the soul. They weren't alone with it necessarily. And they want to confess. That's actually what drives Marjorie to madness, Marjorie Kemp. It's because She thinks she's going to die, and the priest who's confessing her rushes her, and she doesn't get to confess one particular sin. And she never says in the book what the sin is, but it apparently disturbs her so much that she doesn't get to confess this, that she goes, she's harassed by these demons. She has to be tied down so she doesn't hurt herself. So that's sort of the therapy aspect. But on the whole, how did people deal with hardship? I've kind of come around to thinking that they suffered from more things than I realized before. And I'll be quite honest here, anxiety is not a word I heard people talking about a lot 15 years ago. I heard some people talking about anxiety, but it wasn't such a presence in the culture. And, kind of my students telling me about their anxiety, various people talking about their anxiety. And it's very interesting because I also kind of thought, well, this feels like a kind of new thing that everybody is anxious all of the time. Although in many ways we have it better than people used to, who have lived through war or through worse plagues, much worse plagues than the one we've been living through. But I've gone back to all sorts of texts, and I realized sometimes it's about how you translate them. So Beowulf, for example, has a ton of words for fear, which you can translate as care, because they're cognate to care, like charu. But they don't, if you really look at the context, that's not necessarily the best translation. It's often more something like anxiety or fear or terror. And it really has to do, but there are traditions of translation which emphasize the more heroic option, right? That makes them seem less afraid. Julian of Norwich, who's another 14th century mystic, who actually met Marjorie Kemp in person. She spends much of her life in a small cell in Norwich, working on a text of the visions that she had of God. And she talks about fear all of the time. Again, depends on the translation, if they choose anxiety or fear, but her God is a God who makes people less afraid. And the extent to which she talks about fear. I mean, it's amazing how that you read their text and it's clear, like that is the concern, is that people have fear or anxiety, and her God is a loving God, very maternal, who won't even show her hell. She says, I won't go against what Holy Church teaches, but God didn't show me hell. I was only shown heaven. So she is going against what Holy Church teaches. But it's clear the problem is fear. And of course, like she was living through the plague, through, the late years of the Black Death. Of course, everybody was terrified. How would you not be? There was a children's plague later on, that got small children. I mean, they were living in these terrible times, and they talk about fear a lot in their texts. It's just, I think we tend not to see it because we don't focus on it. We focus on other things, or we translate the words in a different way. But I don't know. I think they had. I was working on Mary, Queen of Scots lately and reading some material about her, and the amount that people in that period, in the 16th century, complain about stress and becoming ill because of stress. And a lot of these people have desk jobs, they're spies and so on, but they're spending a lot of time writing. It's weird. They have some of the same issues we do, but it's the 16th century and they're great historic people.
I love it. That I find some comfort in that. That's good.
We're not so weak. We're not so weak.
That's good to know. So in terms of questions, we will go to Thomas and then Camilo, and then we have questions from Anna and Sky as well. We will see if they want to ask themselves. If not, I will read it out. Thomas, do you want to grab the mic?
I'll let Camilo go first.
Oh,
I think his hand was up.
Thank you so much for your honesty.
Thank you,
Camilo,
Thomas.
then Thomas.
Sure. Irina, very interesting so far. You said something that really stuck out to me about how a lot of quote unquote self-help wisdom is transmitted through fables, or even medieval time stories of the advisor and the king and kind of the lessons, the way they taught that. I'm curious as to why you think in modern times you don't really see like a novel in the self-help section, right? A lot of the self-help format is like nonfiction. They might have personal anecdotes, but it's not really like a fable. And I wanted to ask your thought on why you think that is, and also how it relates into the book you're writing on perfectionism.
Well, I think they do have a little bit of the same structure in that they have the example, right? They often they illustrate things through stories and then kind of draw a lesson out of the story. I have also read, I did a paper once on business books based on Machiavelli and Shakespeare. And one of them did actually just do a long fable, so every now and then they get playful with it and they will just make up a story, kind of write a fictional advice literature. But I agree, that's not the usual thing. And my confession, I read a lot of self-help books. They often say at the beginning, they fused certain characters or they changed, so I think it's actually more fictional than it looks at first glance. But it's true. I think we have a different interest in stories that we believe, or stories that have the flavor of truth right now. And that's why memoir and life writing and autofiction and all of these genres, which have a more historical bent or have a different kind of truth claim, are very interesting to people. Yeah, but maybe also, now that I'm thinking about it, maybe if you claim that the story is true, it becomes easier to draw one lesson from it. And that's, that is where I do see a bit of a difference with the medieval, is that they've always got the tongue in cheek, I mean, not always, but so much of the time, if you really read them closely, you see they're it's always a little bit of a play, always a little bit, and when people translate fables, Marie de France translates, I can't remember if it was direct. I don't think it was directly from Aesop. I think it was Aesop through a Latin intermediary, but she translates them into French, and she changes the morals and she plays with them, and she also has some bad morals at the end. So I think the medieval version still really puts the onus on the reader to make up their own mind about the lesson, and sometimes also to read between the lines and see what's not being said. Whereas modern self-help tends to be just much more straightforwardly didactic. And then the true story is useful for that, right? Because you got to show that Lee Iacocca got however many, whatever profits he did, or, that your patient got better after the therapeutical intervention. And then with my book, it's kind of tricky because it's very much in progress, and we're at a very interesting publishing moment in trade publishing when what sells is advice. It's very old-fashioned. It's wildly old-fashioned. What sells are new versions of old stories that are recognizably new versions of the old stories. Not like Gluck's Marjorie Kemp, which I also think is brilliant, Tom. So I think it's the best Marjorie Kemp there is, but that one is wild. But really rewritings of classical medieval stories, etc., and advice based on the ancient wisdom, And so the funny thing is, in my book, I've actually very unwisely and uncommercially kind of resisted that a little bit. And I wanted to tell stories, but leave some more space for the reader. Although I think of it as stealth self-help, but not straightforward, here is the advice. Maybe I just feel uncomfortable with kind of handing the lesson. I think if I did it, I would have to make the lessons all wrong. To be true to my medieval friends.
That is so interesting. I never thought about how we have kind of an inhale, exhale in publishing history when autobiographies sell versus not, because then you also have like the 18th century, right, which I'm a little bit more familiar with, where like if you look at the Dangerous Liaisons, right, it starts like it has a double kind of meta layer. First, there is the introduction that tells you that this is a true story, and all these like the names have been changed, but all these immoral aristocrats were just sleeping around in France, and they did all these terrible things, and then the poor lady had a nervous breakdown and died and whatever. And then there's another letter, an introduction to the introduction, that says, no, this is not true, it's impossible, we found this manuscript. And it's like, you will figure it out, right? You believe whoever you want. Thomas, thank you for your patience and for using the raised hand feature. That's very important.
Yeah, thank you, Irina, for everything so far, and your questions, Anna. And I didn't know that Julian of Norwich met Marjorie Kemp. That's pretty cool. And Anna, you need to read some Julia of Norwich if you don't think being nursed by God has to do with mommy being, it might be problems
I
with
would
mommy in
love
the
to.
medieval area. But
Please.
no, just kidding. But I had a question about, it's a little bit of a tangent in terms of not so much anxiety or what's suffered as the self-help toward what is usually taken, I think, in a contemporary sense as a given, which is being interested or studying things that the medievals, and here I'm thinking more philosophers, I guess, like Aquinas, but curiositas, like that curiosity that is something, it's not good. Something that absorbs you or that you're drawn into or you're passionate about is not always something that you should go with. And in our attention-addled, state, even achieving something like a steady interest in something, it's there was just a article by Adam Kotsko, you may have seen it, about reading and just how people are not reading anything long or being able to summarize it. So it seems kind of to the, a side point as to why curiosity would be a bad thing. But I wonder, just in your readings and your book on perfectionism, if you have things or examples that you would point to in terms of the self-help toward attention or the self-help toward interest as needing to be discerned or guided and not just taken as vital or ennobling or what have you.
The best sources for that are sort of late antique monastic guides. So Cassian, Cassiodorus, and there was very recently a book, a trade book published exactly about the problem of attention in monasticism. And I'm blanking on forgive me, on the author and the title. But I'm sure we could look it up. It was really in the last year or so. That was it's something like the monastic art of attention. But that material is fascinating because if you think about it, they had to, I mean, in a lot of monasteries, they had to pray the whole Psalter once a week, right? And so the moment that repetition already poses the problem of a wandering mind. It's not something new. And the work of the monk is not really done if they're just mouthing the words, right? They have to do it with attention. They have to do it with faith. They have to do it with love, with, it has to be a true prayer. And you see it all over, especially early texts, also Old English, Anglo-Latin texts. This problem comes, it's like the anxiety thing, it actually comes up all over the place in monastic works because it's such a problem, right? How do you just repeat the same text over and over? And often a text that's in a language that's not your own, that you've had to acquire, because you're doing it in Latin, you're not doing it in your own mother tongue. And so, that is a real problem. And so, they also have these sort of various ways of imagining the lack of attention, sometimes very kind of racialized, like there'll be a devil who's imagined as a little Ethiopian boy who's pulling the naughty monk away from prayer and so on. But yeah, it's a real problem for them. So they have to develop all kinds of, I think that's it. Yeah. They have to develop all kinds of techniques to revivify their own interest in this text. I mean, just imagine the same prayers every week for the rest of your life until you die. I mean, it's why, if you think about what a monumental effort that is. And so, I think they're very attentive to what it takes to imbue language with emotion. I think this is a whole technique in the early period. And of course, especially if it's not their own language, you have to imbue a non-native language with emotion, which is another level. But yeah, Cassiodorus talks about it, Cassian talk about it. There they have in their institutes have actual descriptions of it. They also have descriptions of Acadia, right? The sort of the noonday demon, the sort of wandering kind of mind and depression. But yeah, I find that absolutely fascinating because here's what I find fascinating about it. This is my theory, which I realize not everyone will buy. I think they have the experience of the internet before the internet. And what I mean by this is when these monks, especially in late antiquity, when you actually have this wave between the 3rd and 5th centuries of monks going out to the desert, Egyptian desert, Jordanian, etc. The idea is they will leave the city with all of its temptations and go out to the desert, which is empty. But what happens in the desert inevitably is the demons find them and subject them to even worse temptations. So you have the temptation of Saint Anthony, which of course has a huge history, but that they see sexy dancing women, they see gold, they see food, they see drink, all of the things they left behind in the city. Now they get the demonic version of which is trying to distract them from their prayer. That's essentially it. And I think that's the feeling of the internet. You've got to do your work and now everything is coming at you, but in inhuman. It's no longer even a human level of temptation. It's just this kind of avalanche of images, which are meant to distract you. Jerome talks about this too, about images of dancing girls when he's out in the desert. He doesn't make it. He can't cut it in the desert because the desert is actually worse than the city because you're on your own and your mind produces all of that material.
That's fascinating. So you basically choose the mirror world to be safe. And now you're left alone with your mind, which is the most dangerous place there is.
Yeah. And this is the interesting thing I think about self-improvement in this context, is that the move to improve yourself is always also a move towards temptation. So the thing, when I've looked into perfection, for example, they're so worried that the more you work on yourself spiritually, the more you are likely to be proud. And if you become proud, you ruin the whole thing. It's over. So even the process of, leaving aside rich foods and leaving aside sexual temptation and nice clothes and power, worldly power, you do all of those things, and now you've just put yourself in a worse situation, because in that moment, you're likely to think you're better than another person. And that moment when you thought you're better than one other person, it's over for you. So it's this push and pull of self-improvement, but the self-improvement just leads you to more risk. I find that so fascinating.
I sometimes
And I think we don't have as much, right? Like, we don't have the idea of pride. We could use it.
That's what I sometimes feel this with the psychedelic community. Like I have so many friends who, reach ego death, and then they come back and they are so proud of themselves. And I'm like, I think it grew back. Whatever happened, it might have just grown back. Do you think that we are more hubristic these days? Do you think that we were talking on the phone before the salon, and how Queen Elizabeth I was reading Boethius, and the man condemned to death and about to be bludgeoned to death in Constellations of Philosophy. The fact that people were rife with physical ailments, that if you had a family, losing children or even losing wives, was an incredibly common occurrence. And everybody knew somebody who was in mourning. Everybody was mourning themselves. Somebody had died in the past 1 year in your life. People had bigger families, more childbirth. But there was, there was some kind of communal and spiritual life that, do you think it made people more resilient? And do you think that we are taking on too much taking too much on ourselves, trying to solve all these crises ourselves?
I'm always very careful with the pronoun we. I wrote an essay once that started with a lot of we's. It was for the Atlantic, and they said it's our house style not to do this. And I was
okay. Let me say this: the learned of 2024.
Yeah.
Or those seeing themselves as the people of the book.
Well, yes, there is a lot of hubris there. I mean, I think I can say that because I work in a university. I think there's we who are involved in universities could definitely use more humility. I do think, I mean, I think there is something that's happened. This is where I think there is a shift in terms of modernity, that with James Simpson, the medievalist James Simpson said this to me, and it really clarified things for me. He said, what happens in the Reformation is everybody is expected to work on themselves like a monk. That's not a direct quote, but that was the idea, right? That the perfection which had been previously expected of a few people who dedicated themselves to this extraordinary life is now expected of every Christian. And I mean, he sort of views, that's how he views sort of the shift to Protestantism. I don't think it's his original observation, but I do think there is something to that. I think there are these strains which, also have to do with the rise of capitalism, with industrialization, with different kinds of timekeeping, which starts in the Middle Ages, but, it does change over time. That there is an increasing expectation that all people, not just some special people, push themselves to a very high standard of excellence, whether it's moral excellence, physical excellence, excellence of looks, you name it. I do think that is a trajectory that starts in the way in the Middle Ages, but sort of the thing that is monastic and special and elite in the Middle Ages, and certainly not expected of everyone, becomes a kind of general fiat. Again, it's culturally specific and it looks different. I mean, I'm Romanian originally, and perfectionism looked quite different in Romania. So even just in the 5 countries that I've lived in my life, it has its different ways of playing out. But this idea that you have today, where you're working on your body your whole life to kind of stay preternaturally young, and you're always self-improving, and you're working on, your correct speech and your correct ethics. I do think that is a very modern idea. And I think it has to do with a certain kind of fantasy of infallibility, because anyone who has to deal with illness, like the moment you deal with illness, you realize that it sort of falls apart. You can no longer play at that game unless you're very deluded. And I have been deluded in this way. So think I could play the game even with illness. But at some point you just see there's certain things that happen to you that you can't manage, you can't control, you can't self-improve your way out of. But
There are no
I think they
atheists,
all knew that then,
right? There are no atheists on a crashing airplane.
Yeah, I think you're right. I get a little religious myself when the bumps start happening.
Yeah, yeah. Even if the bus is not coming, people start praying. So I think we all have this kind of moral luck to play the atheist sometimes. We were talking earlier about this urban legend that the medieval artists, especially of the Islamic world, were trying to exercise humility and trying to oppose their own internal hubris so much that they left some of their artwork imperfect and made mistakes on purpose, because only God is perfect. But you said that that's an urban legend and it's not necessarily true. But
I know. I just said I did. I haven't seen evidence of that. I just haven't. Yeah, I've looked for evidence of that. I've looked for an actual source and I haven't found one. Doesn't mean it's not true. I can't prove it. Yeah.
Yeah,
but I will say, I do think sometimes they have, in the Middle Ages, you see their aesthetics are much more mixed. They're much more tolerant of having all kinds of different things within the same story or within the same manuscript page, or there are like churches, right? Medieval churches will often have decorations which are not easily visible to the eye. Sometimes there are these green men on the church roofs, which will never be seen by anyone but the artisan or anyone living after the, in the modern day. Or misericords under the seats of the choir, which are sometimes, a little obscene, have these little scenes that are carved into the wood. You have this with manuscript pages where you might have a very serious text, but maybe a monkey with a trumpet in his butt, playing the trumpet, or some kind of group of wild men at the bottom having a little hunt or some kind of scene. So I think they have, the less of a sense of propriety than we might in sort of the modern West, where we think that serious things belong, in one place, and funny, dirty, playful things belong in another place, and they shouldn't really meet. It's kind of a category error to mix them. They don't have that issue so much. They liked this kind of tension between the profane, the sacred, and the profane, which I love. I think it's the way it should be.
I love that. And it might also be, to stop oneself from giving a mortal king or queen the same level of 100% obedience that one is expected to only give to supernatural beings. Sky, you had a question about heaven. Maybe this is the right. Are you well enough to ask, or should I read it up? We have so many philosophers and scholars in this room, by the way. I love it.
Hi, sorry, I'm as Anna said, I've got a virus, but yeah, so I think my question was related to Anna's, which was about so what I was hearing was that, at least in the medieval Christian world, self-help seemed to be like a very religious thing, like either be like monks, get into heaven kind of thing. But I'm just wondering about whether there were other kinds of self-help, like more secular, like streams of self-help.
Absolutely. You have conduct manuals, and these are quite popular in the late Middle Ages. Some of them are translated, for example, from Latin into the vernaculars, but you have them in all kinds of vernaculars. And they, there's one called Stans puerat mensam. It's like a boy stands at the table, and it's instructions for how to behave in polite society, in noble society. And it's things like, if the cup of wine is being passed around, don't dirty it with your greasy lips, or, don't pick your teeth in public, and don't, these kinds of very basic politeness, kind of politeness advice. And that's really at a moment where the merchant class is rising in England, at least, I'll speak about the English ones. The merchant class is rising. You often see these, it's actually very interesting. You often see these advice texts, kind of like courtesy texts, manners, in the same manuscripts as romances, like chivalric romances, Arthurian romances, which often are also very didactic. They show good behavior, bad behavior, and saints' lives, and sometimes other religious texts. And so sometimes what you'll see is, maybe families which are lower gentry or ambitious merchant families will have a big household book that kind of collects all of this useful literature, and it seems to maybe also be used to train children or to sort of educate children. There's one manuscript, the Auchinleck manuscript, which actually has children's scribbles in it as well. So you see, the saints teach you how to sort of be a good, that kind of model of holiness, but the knights are different, and sometimes they also show you negative examples. And then there's this just very didactic material. There are also sometimes gender specific texts, like they're often poems, right? They're often in the form of poetry. There's one, How the Wife Taught Her Daughter, which I actually wrote down. I brought the line because I just loved it so much. Has advice like, don't talk too much, don't walk around from house to house. It's very gendered concern that women will be out of the house and involved in things. And it includes the advice, do not go to wrestling matches or to cock shootings as if you were a strumpet or a harlot, so you have to control your entertainment as well. And then there's another version, How the Man Taught His Son, which has things like, don't eat too late at night because it's not good for your digestion. And then my favorite in that one is, don't go for public office because you can't please everyone. Everybody will hate you, which I think is just fantastic advice. So you have these kind of very pragmatic, conduct literature, but also just like life wisdom, There's a great French book. I'm blanking. Le Ménagier de Paris. That's what it is. It's a book that was, if I'm not mistaken, made in the 14th century by an older bourgeois man, a very well-off bourgeois man, for his much younger wife. I think she was in her early teens when they married, and he was in his 50s. And he put this book together, which is now being edited and translated into English, of all the things she needed to run the household. And it's a major household, so it's like a small business. And he has recipes, food recipes, how to order, amounts of provisioning to take care of. But also the story of Griselda, which is a story about a wife who obeys her husband no matter what he asks of her, So there's a sense of kind of this older man gathering this material, or having it gathered, to train his young wife into the job of being his wife, with also medicinal recipes, all kinds of things, all in this one household book. So yeah, absolutely. There's secular material which has just not very little to do with Christian faith. They're very interested in the English text in honor, on their sort of their reputation in their community, and how other people honor them, or acknowledge their status, how people behave towards each other, how to manage these social relations. And in those situations, they're just remarkably little said about church. Like, I think we have to think of the devotional stuff as really for an elite group of people, but we have a lot of it because we're copying a lot in monasteries. But I think, a lot of this stuff would have also been recited out to people, like these sort of advice texts, taught in various ways. So we just don't have, we have multiple manuscripts, but not as many as we would for the popular religious texts. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That's brilliant. And I was just about to ask you about the gendered aspects of self-help. I don't really know of any era in the history of the written language where we didn't consider men and women as having very, very different emotional and cognitive needs. Do you think that there is something to learn from medieval advice, medieval self-help, when it comes to the equality of
gosh.
I know that we had a sexual history salon 2 years ago, and somebody brought in some very forward, suggesting texts from medieval times about how they a little bit more about the female body than what happened a couple of hundreds of years later. So maybe there was...
Yeah. Oh, I mean, in the terms of the advice texts tend to be quite conservative in a way, right? They tend to be, just in general, they're not going to be about breaking the rules. They're going to be about upholding the rules. It's interesting because in the religious context, actually, the funny thing is, in the religious context, gender matters, but it doesn't matter quite as much, because a woman can become very close to something like a man. A woman can kind of degender herself by staying a virgin. And you do have, especially in, late antiquity, in the early Middle Ages, you have various stories about women who actually live as men in the desert or in a monastery disguised as men. They're now being, they used to be read as transvestite saints. They're now being read as trans saints. But at any rate, women who, kind of, the thing that makes a woman in the Middle Ages is not so much being born a woman as living a sexual life and having children and having sex with a man and focusing her energies on the family. That is sort of maybe the more important part about being a woman in the period, in a spiritual context. And so women can kind of sidestep that and be better, which is male, in the hierarchy of the period, by foregoing a sexual life. So it's very mixed, right? Because on the one hand, it's very gendered, and female virginity is talked about much more than male virginity. But on the other hand, a woman can kind of change her gender a bit. A man doesn't need to, because he's already the better gender.
That's so interesting. But when a man is born a man, Maybe we have a Simone de Beauvoir expert here in the room. I don't know, but this sounds very, very
Yeah.
much something that we discuss nowadays, that women kind of turn themselves into women at some
Yeah,
point.
a little, yeah. Yeah, there is some, you do see that in some texts, that it's really because you can't really focus on God if you have children and a husband to please. The children will cry, the husband will want his dinner, he'll yell at you. You're not thinking about God in that moment. And that's why Marjorie Kemp is so interesting, because she has a husband and she has 14 children. And 14, which only comes up once very late in the book. You're like, and she had 14 children. You mostly don't hear about them at all in her book. But she clearly had a very tough time because her husband, at one point she says to her husband, so, God told me we're not going to have sex anymore. How about that? And we're not going to have dinner together either. And John Kemp says to her, well, if you had to choose between my head being cut off or us, having sexual relations, which would you choose? And she says, I would have your head cut off. But that's very early in the book.
It's an effective contraception method, right?
But, yeah, but the interesting thing, she wants a chaste marriage and he grants it to her, but it means also he has to be chaste for the rest of his life as well, because he can only have sex with her without sinning as much, right? So she's trying to be like a virgin, and she's never going to be a virgin because she's a married woman and a mother, but she's trying to get as close, and she's clearly haunted by it. That's her imperfection. She really feels that she will never be perfect because she's had a sexual life and she's had children. It's, yeah, fascinating conflict, internal conflict there.
And then there were all the widows who moved into, I mean, a lot of prominent nuns became nuns after.
Yeah. So the best thing to be is, this is kind of a very coarse version of the hierarchy. The best thing is for a woman is to be a virgin and then a chaste widow. So you've done the marriage thing to make your family happy, but now you don't remarry, because a widow who remarries is clearly doing it for lust. That's not really true. A lot of widows needed to remarry for protection or for other reasons, but that's sort of the moralizing story. And then after that, a chaste, a wife, and then anybody else is below. So that's
a long way though. Any questions about female chastity or any related concept in the room, or any notes on Simone de Beauvoir? Now is the time. This is the 18+ section of our salon.
Otherwise, I will tell you about the Anka Newissa, which is the weirdest self-help book or advice book of the Middle Ages.
Both. Please tell us that if there are questions, we will make time for that as well.
Okay, this is the most elite of the elite, but I'm sure many of you know this, but in the Middle Ages, you do have people who kind of live as hermits, also in Europe, or as anchorites. And anchorites essentially occupy one small space. It might be one cell, it might be 2 little rooms that are set off from the rest of the world. And they kind of die to the world. They essentially will only live in this one small space alone for the rest of their lives. The ceremony to commit them to the space is like the burial, it's like the funeral ceremony. So they really die to the world. But they sometimes are also in the center of town, and then we'll have a servant who helps carry out waste and bring them food and so on. So Julian of Norwich was an anchoress. We don't know what her name really was. She was attached to the Church of St. Julian's in Norwich, and that's why she's called Julian. But we don't actually know what her name was. And yeah, they're in the cell unless they escape somehow or can't take it. They're in the cell for the rest of their lives, devoted to God, right? And away from all temptation. Okay, not a lot of people do this. This is a very, at one point, I think there may be 13 women in all of England who are doing this in the 13th century or so. The Ancra Newissa is a Middle English advice text, probably written by a man it seems at first for a group of 3 women. I think they were 3 sisters who were all anchoresses, noble women, well-funded. And then it was copied and probably sent to some of the few other women who are doing this. And it advises them on how to watch their soul while they are in this cell, essentially cut off from all of human life. I mean, I'm sure they would have been confessed by a priest and so on. And how to watch every possible temptation, and it's organized by sin, you know, and how to avoid, you know, slipping your finger out the window where it might be touched by somebody. And, you know, not listening to gossip, too much gossip from the town, or listening to people and they're dancing and they're singing, because that might tempt you. And my very favorite detail of this entire book, which is very long and very hard to get through, is he says, if you take a bit of spit and shape your eyebrows, that too is pride. I'm just imagining a woman who's, sometimes they have a little garden so they can actually get sunlight, but a woman who's essentially cut off from the world, who might just fix her eyebrows a little bit. And that moment, even though no one will see her, will be the kind of pride that could destroy the whole exercise. So again, it's one of these things where they're supposed to sit there watching their own emotions and their temptations and their thoughts, and being constantly on the lookout for any potential sin. But it almost feels like there would be more to sin with when they're just sitting there on their own, you know, because your mind would wander, right? How much embroidery can you do? How much can you read the few books you have? How much prayer? And I mean, you don't even have the social aspect of a monastery. So I find it so fascinating. And the writer of The Young Pennywist at the end complains that the book has been so long, and it's taken him so many pains to write it, and he hopes they will all pray for him to make up for the pains he took in writing this book. It's so strange. It's so strange.
Could you repeat the title?
Yeah, you know what? I'll put it in the chat, because it has two titles that are used. And there's also a pretty new translation of that, from Exeter, I think, from Exeter University Press. It's fascinating reading. It's fascinating reading.
Talk about perfectionism, right? It's like trying to be emotionally perfect. It's kind of
Just being on the watch for every last sliver. And then, you know, it has these descriptions of the different kinds of anger and the different kinds of lust and the different, you know, so a lot of understanding sin is about breaking it down into its different components and then identifying the exact one that you suffer from.
That's great. I never really thought about how, I mean, you know, of course, the inner thought police, I think, idea is familiar to everybody who has ever encountered religion in some ways. But I think this is something that does not that much exist out in the secular self-help movement. I mean, we do have, you know, different instances of self-monitoring, but not for this kind of goodness. I think it kind of, in a utilitarian way, yes, like effective altruists, like the outcome of your actions be as good as possible. But the internal, I think it's at least in this particular moment, when I say we, the 2024 extremely online intelligentsia, I think it's less prominent at this point. Anna had a question, and also Eli, but I know that Anna, you're on a train to Boston. I don't know if you can share in audio or even video, but we will give a moment if you want to jump in. Oh, sound is terrible, and she will speak another time. Okay, I just found your message. But there was a question earlier. How do you distinguish between self-help and spiritual guidance? What is the fundamental feature of self-help? Anna asked. Very interesting so far, she said. She added.
Thank you. Do I have to distinguish between it? I think I mean, okay, to be fair, do you have a sort of some kind of overlay or some kind of power you're directed towards that isn't purely internal, right? Is that?
So I've also asked, I try and speak, but there's another question I've asked which breaks it down more about where you might find tips on, it's really connected to Sky deepened that question, but tips on sexual prowess, fertility, wealth, health, and the kinds of things. My mother, I said, was an Icelandic scholar, and she found out a lot of those kind of folkloric oral tradition. So I was just interested in the medieval context for how to live well, have sex and prosper?
I mean, you have recipe books sometimes. In Old English, we have several books, like they're called leech books, or books of medicinal recipes. One of them was recently tested. I mean, recently, about 5 years ago, a group of scholars actually tested one that was for eye infection, and it worked really well on some viruses. It worked actually very, very well. And the theory was that sometimes these things sort of become useless as the viruses adapt, but if they're left alone for a long time, they can work again, because the viruses then readapt to other medicines. Unfortunately, my early medieval English people are not so good on the sexual tips. That sadly, you get more of that in the late Middle Ages. I don't know that kind of material as well, like the very, very practical material. There is a series of texts that go under the name of Trotula. I'm gonna put that in the chat. These have been edited by Monica Green, and they are gynecological texts that were sort of assumed to be written by a woman. There are several texts that go under this name, and they have all kinds of advice for pregnancy, getting pregnant, guiding the pregnancy, or sort of having a healthy pregnancy, what the pregnant woman should eat, how she should be treated, what kind of baths she should take, what kinds of
How
massages.
terrible is it from like 1 to 10? Like, is it like a horror book, or is it okay?
Well, it does become a horror book at one point, because they also deal with complications. And so you realize, I mean, this is a period when a lot of women do die in the process, and that's visible. But some of the advice seems quite nice, they give them a little wine toddy, spiced wine, and then a hot bath with herbs. It just seems quite nice, I didn't mind that when I was pregnant. I mean, I didn't have the wine, but in the Middle Ages, it's probably not such a bad idea. But no, they are medical texts, so they also deal with complications, and some of the ways they try to deal with complications are horrific to read about. There's another text, I'm trying to remember the name of it. There was late medieval French text, which was sort of women gossiping, a bunch of sort of women gossiping. I'll have to look up the title for you, because it's not coming to mind, but and also kind of discussing sex and pregnancy, and how to tell if it's a boy or a girl, that kind of thing. I would have to look up the title, but this is also a fascinating text, but it's much more not as medicinal, not as associated with the universities. It's really, that particular text is more of the people, more of that kind of accessible text, and it doesn't often, sometimes the advice is really very different from the Trotula texts, which were university texts in Latin and so on. But then you have the fabliaux in French, which are very sexy. Not all of them have to do with sex, but very many of them do. And some of them, I think if you read them the right way, they are also good advice for a healthy sexual life, but you have to be a little bit of a creative reader. So, I wrote once for the LRB about one of these tales, these sort of short comic tales in verse, about a young woman who could not stand to hear her fucking. And a young man comes along to her father's house, and he learns about this problem that she has, that she just absolutely cannot stand to hear any dirty language. And he manages to get an invitation to stay overnight, and he worms his way into her room, and he makes love to her, but he refers to everything involved as something else. Like, he talks about his little stallion who's thirsty and needs to go into the garden and have a drink of water, and she gets into it. And she, uses the same language, and they spend the night together having a wonderful time. And it's such a funny tale, because at first you think, oh, she can't stand sex, but actually, no, she just can't stand dirty language. And the end result is a very consensual encounter. You also think it'll be like you'll trick her into sex, or she won't really know what's going on. It'll be somehow involve force. But no, she's completely into it. Just if she call it a fountain, or is your little stallion okay in my fountain? Would he like to drink some more? And highly explicit, but put in different language. So I think like if you read a tale like that, that could have that sense of, okay, what would be an encounter that would be mutually pleasing to both people? How could that be staged? And that might involve a bit of a sense of humor and creativity.
I love this. Thank you so much. And this sounds like good advice to men. Like it's not necessary. Maybe
use the right language.
Sweetheart is not really against sex. She just doesn't want to hear you speak like you speak with your friends. Just like some poetry can help. I love it. Eli, do you want to ask I think the last question of the salon before we wrap up? Yours is the outro. Thank you so much, Anna, for the great question. And Irina, I loved it. I took so many notes. I will order so many books. I'm sure this salon, I can see it.
Irina, could you repeat the title of the fablio that you just mentioned, the one about the stallion and the fountain? That sounds very interesting.
Everybody will read it. Amazon will not understand what happens. Why is everybody ordering this book?
I think it's La Demoiselle. I'm trying to reproduce the old French. I'm sorry. Qui ne peut ouvrir parler de foutre. This is not, if you Google this, it will not come out exactly like that, but it's close to this. And there's there's a very recently published volume of fabliaux by, if you give me a moment, I can look it up for you. If I might have to send that. No, I think it's Dubin, Nathaniel Dubin, or Dubin. Which has that under a different title, slightly more polite title. It's a woman who couldn't hear the dirty language or lewd language, but he has a huge, collection of fabliaux translated, and they're just a blast. I mean, so many private parts, more than you could take a stick at. But they're very short and they're very witty and they're very clever. So they, they have. There's one elaborate fabliau where 3 young women are asked to answer a kind of question: what is older? Forgive my language, but what is older, my con or me? Like, who is older than? And one of them says, well, I have teeth and it doesn't, or it has a beard and I don't, or there are all kinds of very clever sort of sort of pulling on university traditions of debate, ways of figuring out, which part is older, the genitals or the woman. And yeah, they used to, the scholars used to think they were sort of for a very lower class audience, because of course only the lower classes could enjoy that kind of humor. And they often have lower class characters. And I think now scholars don't think that anymore. They realize that the nobility were perfectly capable of enjoying stories about, raunchy farmers and their wives.
Right. So thanks for recommending Count Lucanor, by the way. It sounds super interesting. And it reminded me that I have read something from that period. The Book of Good Love. Have you heard of it? It's very alive in Mexico.
Libro de Buen Amor, yeah.
Yes. My father quotes that to me. Yeah, it's a book of advice about love. Yeah.
I have, what? I left my copy of that book in my grandfather's apartment in Romania in the year 2000. And I kept thinking I would get it back and I didn't. I just bought it again last year. So I still haven't read it, but I will now read it. I'll put it to the top of the pile. Is it good advice? Is it good love advice?
It's very simple. It's like you should always be presentable, because who knows when you might find the girl of your dreams. It's stuff like that. It's simple, but it has some interesting poetry. But anyway, my comment was my question was very short. It's about something you said in your Times article. You mentioned that most self-help is read by women. And I was very surprised by that, because I didn't know that was gender coded. If anything, I thought self-help was I read a lot of self-help. So I thought it was a male thing to do. Does that depend on how you define self-help, or how did you arrive to that?
You know what? I don't remember. I must have looked that up somewhere, but I do not remember where I found the information. It's interesting. I feel like there's a huge online culture of self-help that's very male-oriented, right? there's the sort of the podcasting. I've become absolutely fascinated with this. So, and a lot of it has to do with relentless self-improvement. Like Andrew Huberman, like this Stanford professor, where he has this sort of protocol for how you should run your mornings. I find that absolutely fascinating because it's really like a masculine version of the relentlessly perfectionistic standards that a lot of women hold themselves to, but it's optimization, how to optimize. Camilo, are you a consumer of these, or have you watched some?
Only the first one, not the latter.
Yeah, I find this fascinating because it's its own genre, which I guess has its element in books, but it seems to be a very online genre right now, and very much connected to certain ideas of masculinity. Like I noticed Huberman used to have the faculty photo. I don't know him at all, so I have no beef with him, but I find it interesting. His faculty photo was very, clean shaven and academic, and now he's sort of very bulky and has this big beard. And so I do think there's kind of an interesting moment now in, working out ways to be masculine in the West, which I guess needs to be done, right? But yeah, I find that absolutely fascinating. So I don't know if it's true. I would have to go, maybe if we took in the online space, that wouldn't even be true.
Thank you so much. I think my last question is not a question, it's more like a request for recommendation. Do you feel that there is maybe a medieval text that we are more familiar with, or something that we've never heard about, or that's not known outside the academic community devoted to this, that you think is in fact a self-help text, and we should know about it, or there is something to take away, even though it might not be considered as such?
Oh, the Decameron.
Say more.
I mean, Boccaccio writes about this in several. I'm not a Boccaccio expert by any means, but I'm interested in him, and he has very much this idea that, well, okay, this is not exactly the same as self-help, to be fair, but this idea that literature can get you through tough times. And the Decameron, partly does this through escapism, right? And escapism has its legitimacy. I think it's not just a negative thing necessarily. It's sometimes, if you're in an absolutely miserable situation, you just need to not think about it for a certain amount of time, because they know that stress makes you unwell. This is not a new finding. Sometimes, I mean, in other works, Boccaccio talks about presenting a sad story so that the reader will find solace in reading about someone who's so much more miserable than they are. But this is like a legitimate, there's something about, I mean, the big picture is that all of literature is self-help in the Middle Ages, or in before Romanticism. I think there isn't this idea that a work of literature would be a purely aesthetic text. That is a modern idea, right? And of course, they know that some texts are meant more to delight, and some texts are meant more to be useful or to be instruct. This is the Horatian maxim, it's like aut prodesse delectare, I'm misquoting it, but the idea is texts, poets either want to be of use, or to do good, or to delight. But I don't think they think of literature as the aesthetic object that's set apart from daily life. It's all potentially there to live with, which also doesn't mean you reduce it to that, but it's always got both aspects of the delight and the usefulness. And to me, it's very strange that because I live so much of my life with medieval texts, it's strange that we have this modern assumption that you could draw a clean line. And I think that's why self-help is it's a genre that's looked down upon, because, literature is higher, and the more entertaining it is, the lower it is, and the more useful it is, then it gets really low, right? And that kind of division, I just think, doesn't exist in the Middle Ages in the same way. That's why, it talked about Boethius, and obviously Boethius is was a philosopher, so you could say is high. But King Alfred has him translated. Chaucer translates Boethius. Elizabeth I translates Boethius. The idea that you would read texts in order to live with them or to learn something out of them to incorporate what you can, to question them too. It doesn't mean, it's not an unquestioning connection with them. Chaucer shows some of the limitations of Boethius's consolation in Troilus and Crusade. I mean, I think that's just basic in the pre-modern period. But again, not in this kind of didactic, here's the lesson, swallow it, but more that you would have an engagement with the text and you would have to kind of dig into it and figure out what to draw from it. I think that's how they're looking at the material a lot of the time. And that's why the stories are often much more complicated than we give them credit for. They don't give us really clear heroes. They don't really give us these sort of great, perfect figures. They give us imperfect figures. That is what I love, because the imperfection is what makes it interesting.
That's so interesting. I mean, there is a level of fiction where the reader is supposed to experience a kind of catharsis, but we don't necessarily equate the experience of catharsis with what is the takeaway of the Neapolitan Quartet, right?
Yes.
It's life. What is the takeaway of War and Peace? It's all of life. The takeaway is how overwhelming it is that life is so big and we are so little. I don't like, it's simply, you can't tweet about it, right? But we have singer-songwriters today, right? Like you have Taylor Swift is a self-help machine. Like people, it's not the kind of catharsis that you have encountering one of the greatest novels of our literary history, but they are almost like little takeaways, little one-liners, zingers that people can quote. And I will have to think after this salon whether because contemporary poetry has a lot of self-help ambitions, at least.
Structured that way, right? That sort of moment of revelation at the end of a lyric. Yeah, that's true. That's true. And a lot of essays, a lot of memoir is like that too. Memoir is interesting. It's actually very much structured in that way because the way a lot of people speak about it is there being some gift to the reader or something for the reader that is greater than the individual story. If you write a memoir and it's just about your individual story, unless you are an extremely famous person, no, people don't tend to care, right? So memoir has that element built in. And that's really expected, I think, as part of the genre, of that there being some kind of recognition or change or understanding through the process that, that then the reader can take with them. Yeah, unless you're just very famous and they're reading it for gossip. But even then, sometimes, like Michelle Obama has written 2 books, right? And the first one was more memoir, and the second, more like autobiography memoir, and the second one is more in the self-help genre. And I think that's kind of a natural direction in a way.
In that sense, we are basically doing medieval literature, no? I mean, when you talk about like people relying on their life experience and all the things that they overcame, and then they share it with people based on autobiographical, basically their own proof of work of experience, right?
Yeah, I think what I see in the medieval that I don't see as often as I would like in the modern is that little poke at authority, that little wryness, the laughter about it, the sort of...
Why is that? We see ourselves as so disrespectful, disruptive even, and we are more idiots?
No, we're not. I don't think. I think, I mean, so
it would get canceled for Pantagruel, no? Like you couldn't just be able to like tweet that stuff.
I think and sometimes they have to be very subtle about it, but I think there is a sort of structural sense, a lot of the teachers in medieval texts are not really meant to be taken seriously. There's actually an argument by the philosopher whose name I've just slipped, it'll come to me, that's about the consolation of philosophy, which is about lady philosophy, teaching Boethius how to detach from what he thought was good in the world, what he thought was valuable in the world, so as not to be as miserable about the fact that he's going to be executed. And there's an argument about that book published in the last 10 years or so, that philosophy actually fails, and that the book but the consolation of philosophy belongs to a late antique genre called Menippean satire, in which the teachers are often meant to be figures of mockery, or they're not meant to be taken absolutely seriously, and that we miss it when we read it straight, as it were, and think that philosophy is right.
Actually, the text that we used for this salon from Eon by somebody called John Marenbon talks about this.
He's the one who told me about the book. He's the one.
Yeah. It's Relihan, I think. Joel
Yes,
Relihan.
it's Joel Relihan. Yes,
Yeah.
Is it not the prisoners? It's not the prisoner's dilemma, but it's the prisoners. Yeah. And what's interesting is, I mean, so the idea is supposed to be Boethius was a Christian, and there's no mention of Christianity in the consolation of philosophy. In Relihan's, the idea is philosophy fails, and then at the end, all that's left is Christian faith. And what's very interesting is when Chaucer does a translation of the consolation of philosophy, but then he also incorporates lots of it into Troilus and Crusade, which ends with Troilus dying. And it's almost like he realizes the limitations of the consolation, because at the end, he sticks in Christian faith, although it doesn't belong in that story at all. It's a story about ancient Troy. But it's really, and there's been an article, unfortunately, I noticed this, but someone else had already written the article, but it's like Chaucer already discovered that argument that Joel Relihan made, that the consolation fails, and he put in the Christian faith at the end. But I think what's interesting about it is just that we shouldn't assume that when someone is a teacher in one of these texts that they're meant to be taken as the absolute bearer of truth. They're always meant to be questioned. And you see that in dialogues. That's why they love dialogues. They love this process of questioning and debating. And I try to instill in my students too, not to take me too seriously and to debate with me, but they're usually too polite these days.
I do think we have a politeness problem, and if
it's a power differential, it's a power problem.
Yeah, and I think for me, like even just like going through all the texts for this event, I think this intellectual autonomy is so inspiring to me. And I don't know if this was granted to people through their faith, through the precariousness of life, that everything can be just gone, in a second, which is something that we don't really, I mean, unless you live in very specific parts of the world, you probably have this enormous good fortune to not really have to think about that. They were badass. We think about them like Jean Reno would play them with black teeth in some comedy, and no, these are like very intellectually active people.
They develop clever ways to say what they mean. They don't put it all on the surface. That's the thing. They're dealing with power structures too, and they can, depending on when they're active, they can be put on a stake and burned as well. Not for witchcraft, but for heresy, yes, in the Middle Ages. So they are also dealing with power relations, and very dangerous, I mean, depending on when and where, they're also dealing with potentially extremely dangerous consequences, for being frank. But that's why I find someone like Julian very interesting, because here's this woman writing her visions of God, and God shows her heaven, and when it comes to hell, she says, I wasn't shown hell. I'm not contradicting Holy Church's teaching. I believe in everything that Holy Church teaches. It just so happens that God didn't show me hell.
Yes.
So she said it, right? But she's claimed she didn't say it,
Yeah.
So they have, I think that's the art. They're not necessarily bold in the sort of just saying God doesn't exist, or there is no hell, or whatever it is. I mean, there are also those people, right? There are also heretics, and there are also people who believe in different, even within Christianity, different versions of the faith. But you also have people who are trying to kind of find their way and survive and not have their work or themselves destroyed. But that's when you have to read between the lines a little bit.
And that's where your
We can do that too.
Yeah. I love that Anna Motz was here, because she's a forensic psychologist, and there's a wonderful article in the New Yorker from a couple of days ago about her new book. I think the article is called When Women Commit Violence. Thank you so much, Irina. I would listen to you forever, but I understand that you are 1 hour ahead of me, and maybe this is bad time. please write all the books. Like, no need to be like, no need for perfection. We want to hear all your stories. You're brilliant. All of this is highly relevant for our lives in the 21st century. We will read your books and we will invite you back, please. Is there?
I think the medieval sex advice would probably actually sell very well.
Oh my God, especially the little like, I want the spiced wine and the bath without the pregnancy. Just the bath. Thank you. Yeah, and you have a newsletter, which is yourname.substack.com, right? Where you share more of this good